It was supposed to be a getaway, a deep-sea fishing trip to shake off the stress of work and life. Just me, my buddy Rick, and the endless blue expanse of the Gulf of Mexico. I didn't think twice when Rick suggested the charter boat. Captain Henry had rave reviews, an old salt with decades of experience. His boat, the Mariner, was small but sturdy, perfect for reeling in the biggest catches. We set out early, before dawn. The sun rose like a molten coin, turning the water into rippling gold. It was stunning out there, miles from the shore. No land in sight, just the hypnotic rhythm of the waves. For hours, we cast our lines and joked around. The first few catches were modest, red snapper, a grouper, but the anticipation of bigger fish kept us energized. Captain Henry was a quiet guy, focused. I remember him squinting at the horizon more than once, muttering under his breath. "Storm's brewin'," he said at one point, even though the sky was clear. Rick and I exchanged a look, but we figured he knew what he was doing. Around midday, Rick got a bite. Not just any bite, a monster. His rod bent so sharply I thought it would snap. "Get the gaff!" Rick yelled, his face red with effort. Captain Henry grabbed it and leaned over the side as Rick fought to reel the thing in. And that's when I saw it. The water beneath the boat churned violently, frothing as if something massive was thrashing just beneath the surface. I caught a glimpse, a shadow, long and sinuous, much too large for a fish. A sickening dread coiled in my gut. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, but Rick didn't hear me. He was grinning like a maniac, focused on his prize. Henry, though, froze. His weathered face went pale, and he dropped the gaff like it burned him. "Cut the line," he said hoarsely. "What?" Rick shouted. "Are you crazy? I've got it right here." I said, "Cut the goddamned line," Henry roared, panic flashing in his eyes. "You don't know what you've hooked?" Rick hesitated, looking at me for support, but before he could decide, the rod jerked violently. It ripped out of his hands and disappeared into the water. He stumbled back, cursing, but I could only stare at the ocean. The shadow was still there, circling the boat like a predator sizing up its prey. Henry started the engine. "We're leaving," he barked. "But," Rick began. "Now," Henry snapped. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, and the boat began to lurch forward. But before we could pick up speed, the entire vessel shuddered. It felt like we'd hit something, though we were in open water. A horrible, grinding noise echoed beneath us. "Jesus Christ!" Rick yelled. "What was that?" Henry's hands flew across the controls, his knuckles white. "It's here," he muttered, almost to himself. I told you. The boat lurched again, harder this time, nearly tossing me overboard. Something was ramming us. I scrambled to the edge, peering into the water, and there it was. I'll never forget it. A massive serpentine form, its scales glinting darkly in the sunlight. And its eyes. God, those eyes. They were huge, unblinking, and inhumanly yellow. They locked onto me like a predator sizing up a meal. The thing rose higher, revealing more of its body. It wasn't just a fish or a snake. It was something ancient, something that shouldn't exist. Its head breached the surface, long, narrow, with rows of jagged teeth, and let out a sound. Not a roar, not a hiss, but something between the two, low and guttural, vibrating through my bones. Rick screamed. He was pointing at the stern, where the thing's tail, a muscular, whip-like appendage, slammed into the boat with incredible force. Wood splintered, and the boat tilted precariously. Water poured in from the crack it had created. "We're sinking!" I shouted. Henry didn't respond. He was shouting into a radio, but all we heard was static. "Mayday! Mayday! This is the Mariner! We're under attack!" His voice cracked with desperation. No answer. Then, the tail struck again. The boat tilted violently, throwing Rick overboard. He hit the water with a splash, his screams cutting through the chaos. I rushed to the edge, reaching for him, but he was already too far out. I'll never forget his face, the sheer terror as he looked behind him. The creature was there, circling him. Rick didn't stand a chance. The thing surged forward, its maw opening wide, and he disappeared beneath the waves. Just like that, gone. No blood, no bubbles, just silence. I stood there, frozen, my mind refusing to process what I'd just seen. Henry grabbed my arm, snapping me out of it. "We have to go," he said, his voice grim. The boat was barely afloat, listing heavily to one side. Henry shoved a life jacket at me. "If it goes under, you jump and swim like hell. Don't look back." "What about you?" He didn't answer. He was focused on the water, his hand on the throttle, pushing the engine to its limit. The boat groaned in protest, but we started moving, barely. And then it came again. The tail smashed into us one final time, and the boat split apart. I hit the water hard, the shock of it knocking the air from my lungs. I kicked to the surface, gasping, and looked around. Pieces of the boat were everywhere. Henry was clinging to a chunk of debris, yelling something, but I couldn't make it out. Then, the creature rose again. It loomed over us, its impossibly long body twisting around the wreckage. It didn't attack immediately. It just watched, as if savoring our fear. Henry shouted something, a challenge, a curse, I don't know, and it turned its gaze on him. The last thing I saw was the creature lunging at him and its jaws snapping shut with horrifying finality. I swam. I don't know how long or how far, but I swam until my arms felt like lead, until the saltwater burned my throat. Eventually, a fishing vessel found me, half conscious and clinging to a piece of the wreck. I told the Coast Guard everything. They searched for days, but found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies. They chalked it up to a storm, a rogue wave. No one believed me. But I know what I saw. Sometimes late at night, I hear the sound it made, that low, guttural noise that haunts my dreams. And sometimes when I look out at the ocean, I think I see something just beneath the surface, watching.
Story number 2.
When I was a kid, my dad was obsessed with deep-sea fishing. Every summer, he'd book a trip, dragging my mom, my little sister Cassie, and me along for what he called a real adventure. I never loved it. The vast, open ocean always made me uneasy. But Dad was a Navy vet, confident as hell on the water, so I figured we were always safe. The summer I turned 16, Dad outdid himself. He booked a trip with a local legend named Captain Joe, a man known for taking his charters to the sweet spots miles off the coast of Maine. Captain Joe had this ancient, creaky boat called the Widowmaker. I remember joking about the name, but he just gave me a grim smile and said, "It's not the boat that makes widows, it's the sea." That morning was picture perfect. Clear skies, calm waters, just enough wind to keep things cool. Cassie and I stayed on the deck while Mom read in the cabin. Dad and Captain Joe were up front, swapping fishing stories. Everything felt fine, normal. But by the time we were about 20 miles out, the air changed. It wasn't just the sudden drop in temperature. The sea felt different too. The waves grew choppy, and a gray haze crept in, muffling the sound of the engine and the seagulls. I couldn't explain it, but the silence felt wrong, like the ocean itself was holding its breath. Dad noticed too. "Storm coming?" he asked Joe, but the captain didn't answer. He was staring at the horizon, his face pale and tight. Then he muttered something I didn't catch and throttled down the engine. "What's wrong?" Dad asked again, louder this time. Joe turned to us, his voice low and sharp. "We're leaving, now." "Leaving? We've barely started fishing," Dad protested, but Joe ignored him, yanking the wheel around to turn us back. And that's when the first scream came. It wasn't human. It sounded like a wail, maybe, but distorted, high-pitched and broken like something in pain. It echoed across the water, making my skin crawl. "What the hell was that?" Dad asked, his bravado cracking. Joe's hands tightened on the wheel. "Something we don't want to meet." "Hold on." The boat surged forward, cutting through the now violent waves. I grabbed Cassie's arm as she stumbled, her wide eyes locking onto mine. "What's happening?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer. The scream came again, louder, closer. This time it was followed by a splash, a huge one, like something massive had broken the surface. Joe swore under his breath, and I saw him glance at the fish finder. The screen was lit up, pulsing red, like we were sitting on top of a swarm of something alive. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow deep below us. It moved fast, circling the boat in dizzying loops. Then it rose, breaking through the surface with a sickening grace. I can't describe it perfectly. Nothing that big and unnatural should exist. It was like a cross between an eel and a shark, but far too large, its skin slick and pale, glistening like it had never seen sunlight. Its eyes were the worst. They were black, endless voids that seemed to suck in the light. It wasn't just looking at us, it was studying us. Cassie screamed, and I yanked her back as the thing lunged toward the boat, its jagged, needle-like teeth snapping shut inches from the hull. Joe threw the throttle forward. The thing was faster. It slammed into the side of the boat with a force that sent all of us sprawling. "Get inside!" Joe shouted, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the creature as it coiled around the boat, its massive body squeezing tight. The hull groaned and water began to seep in through the cracks. Dad grabbed my arm, dragging me and Cassie toward the cabin. Mom was already inside, clutching her book like it could somehow protect her. The boat tipped sharply to one side, and we all tumbled into a heap. Joe was yelling into the radio, but all we could hear was static. He cursed and grabbed a flare gun from a cabinet, loading it with shaking hands. "Stay inside," he barked, then disappeared back onto the deck. We huddled together, the sound of the creature's body scraping against the boat echoing around us. Mom was crying, whispering prayers under her breath. Cassie clung to me, shaking so hard I thought she might pass out. Then there was a loud bang, a gunshot maybe, or the flare, and the boat jolted violently. Joe screamed, but it was cut off by a horrible wet crunching sound. "Dad!" I screamed as he bolted out of the cabin, ignoring Mom's pleas to stay put. He grabbed a knife from the counter and ran onto the deck. I crawled to the window, my heart pounding, and saw him swinging the blade wildly at the creature. It reared back, its jaws opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to go on forever. Then it struck, snatching Dad in its mouth like a doll. He didn't even have time to scream. The boat tipped again, harder this time, and water began pouring in. Mom pulled me and Cassie toward the emergency raft, her voice frantic. "We have to go! Now!" We scrambled into the raft as the boat groaned beneath us, its hull splitting apart. Cassie was sobbing uncontrollably, and Mom was trying to inflate the raft with shaking hands. I looked back just in time to see the Widowmaker vanish beneath the waves, the creature dragging it down like it was nothing. We floated there for hours, clinging to each other as the fog thickened around us. The creature didn't come back, but the memory of it, its eyes, its scream, hung in the air like a curse. Eventually, a Coast Guard ship found us. They took us ashore, wrapped us in blankets, and asked us what happened. I told them the truth, every horrifying detail. They didn't believe me, of course. They said it was a rogue wave, maybe a whale, something explainable. But I know better. Sometimes I think about the fish finder, about the mass of red beneath the boat. That thing wasn't alone. It never is.
Story number 3.
I never thought I'd be the type to enjoy deep-sea fishing, but when my girlfriend Sarah insisted, I caved. "You'll love it," she said. "The quiet, the open water, it's peaceful." She'd gone every summer since she was a kid, and her enthusiasm was contagious. So we booked a trip off the coast of Oregon with her uncle Jake, a seasoned fisherman who owned a weathered but sturdy boat called the Devil's Haul. The day started off as a postcard-perfect morning. The sky was a brilliant blue, the waves were calm, and the smell of salt water filled the air. Jake was a character, grizzled, sunburned, with a raspy laugh that seemed to carry over the waves. He steered the boat while Sarah and I lounged on the deck, enjoying the sun. We were about 30 miles out when Jake killed the engine. Here's a good spot," he said, pulling out rods and bait. "Big fish, might even catch a shark if we're lucky." The idea of a shark made me nervous, but Sarah was thrilled. She cast her line with practiced ease, her smile so wide it made me forget my nerves. For a while, it was perfect. The boat rocked gently, the water sparkling under the midday sun. I even started to enjoy the quiet, the sense of being completely detached from the rest of the world. And then Sarah got a bite. At first, it seemed like a good catch. Her line went taut, and she had to fight to reel it in. Jake leaned over her shoulder, coaching her through it, his voice excited. "Easy now. Don't let it snap the line." But as the minutes passed, his tone changed. The rod bent dangerously, groaning under the strain, and Sarah's face turned red with effort. Whatever she'd hooked was huge. "Cut it loose," Jake said suddenly, his voice sharp. "What?" Sarah looked at him, confused. "I said, cut it loose," Jake barked, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something grim. "But it's right here," Sarah shouted back, pointing to the water. I followed her gaze and saw something massive thrashing just beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was a shark, its sleek, dark form slicing through the water. But then I noticed its size. It was far too large, its body stretching impossibly long, and its fins, jagged, irregular, more like spines than fins. "Jake, what the hell is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He grabbed a knife and sliced through Sarah's line himself. She protested, but he ignored her, yanking the engine's cord to start it up. "We're leaving," he said, his eyes locked on the water. The engine roared to life, and the boat surged forward. I glanced back, hoping whatever was in the water would vanish beneath the waves. But it didn't. It followed us. The thing moved with terrifying speed, keeping pace with the boat. Every now and then, it would breach the surface, revealing glimpses of its grotesque body. It wasn't just one creature. It looked like a mass of them, twisted together, their shapes merging and writhing. It was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Jake cursed under his breath, pushing the throttle as far as it would go. "Hang on!" he shouted as the boat slammed through the waves. The creature didn't tire. It grew bolder, its spined fins cutting through the water closer and closer to the boat. Then, With a sickening crash, it rammed the hull. The impact sent me sprawling, my head slamming against the deck. Sarah screamed, clutching the railing as the boat tilted dangerously to one side. "It's trying to sink us," Jake shouted, grabbing a flare gun from a nearby crate. He fired it into the water, and for a moment, the thing retreated. But it didn't last. Another impact rocked the boat, and this time, the sound of splintering wood filled the air. "Get the life vests!" Jake yelled. Sarah and I scrambled to the cabin, yanking open the storage compartment. The boat lurched again, and water began pouring in through a crack in the hull. "We're taking on water," Sarah shouted. Jake fired another flare, but it was no use. The thing breached the surface entirely now, its writhing mass towering over the boat. It wasn't like any sea creature I'd ever seen. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and covered in what looked like gills that opened and closed, exhaling clouds of murky water. Its eyes, dozens of them, were scattered across its body, each one black and glistening like oil. It screamed. The sound wasn't natural. It was like metal grinding against metal, mixed with the wail of something alive. The boat tipped violently as the creature slammed into it again, its massive body wrapping around the hull. Jake grabbed the wheel, trying to steer us away, but the boat was barely functional. Water gushed in faster now, rising to our ankles. "Abandon ship," Jake shouted. We didn't argue. Sarah and I grabbed the life vests and jumped into the water. The shock of the cold hit me like a punch, stealing my breath. I turned to look for Jake, but he was still on the boat, a harpoon in his hands. "Jake, get out of there!" Sarah screamed. He didn't listen. With a roar, he launched the harpoon at the creature, striking it just below one of its eyes. The thing let out an ear-piercing shriek, thrashing violently. For a moment, I thought he'd killed it. But then it turned, its writhing body slamming into the boat with all its might. The hull split apart and Jake disappeared in a spray of water and splinters. "Jake!" Sarah screamed, but I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the life raft that had deployed from the wreckage. We climbed aboard, shaking and soaked, watching as the Devil's Haul vanished beneath the waves. The creature circled us for what felt like an eternity, its eyes glinting in the dim light. But it didn't attack. Eventually, it sank back into the depths, leaving only ripples behind. Hours later, a rescue boat found us. They didn't believe our story, of course. They said it was a rogue wave, maybe a whale. But I know what we saw. Sometimes late at night, I hear the creatures scream in my dreams. And when I look out at the ocean, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting.
Story number 4.
When my brother Tom invited me on a deep-sea fishing trip, I almost said no. I'm not much for the ocean, too big, too empty, and too full of things I'd rather not think about. But Tom was insistent. He just bought a sleek fishing boat, his pride and joy, and he was itching to show it off. "Come on, Nick," he said, "just you and me. We'll catch some monsters." I agreed, mostly to shut him up. We set off at dawn, leaving the sleepy Florida coast behind. The water was calm, the sky streaked with pink and gold. I had to admit, it was beautiful. Tom was in his element, grinning as he steered the boat into deeper waters. "Just wait," he said. "I know a spot where the big ones bite like crazy." By mid-morning, we were miles offshore. Nothing but endless blue in every direction. The isolation made my skin crawl, but Tom was oblivious, setting up our rods with the kind of excitement he usually reserved for football games. We cast our lines and waited. Hours passed with nothing to show for it but sunburns and a couple of beers. I was ready to call it a day when Tom's rod jerked violently. "Got one!" he shouted, gripping the pole with both hands. The line screamed as whatever was on the other end fought back, hard. I grabbed a gaff and leaned over the side, ready to help him haul it in. "Feels huge!" Tom grunted, his muscles straining. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the line went slack. "Damn it!" Tom shouted. "Maybe it snapped," I said, but he shook his head. "No way. That wasn't a fish. It was something else." He reeled in the line, and my stomach dropped when I saw the hook. The steel was twisted, mangled like a soda can someone had crushed in their fist. "What the hell could do that?" I asked. Tom didn't answer. His excitement had evaporated, replaced by a quiet tension. He scanned the water, his eyes narrowing. "Let's move," he said finally. He started the engine, but before we could leave, the boat shuddered violently. I nearly lost my footing as the deck tilted, and a loud thunk echoed from beneath us. "What was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom didn't answer. He cut the engine and leaned over the side, peering into the water. "It's probably just," he didn't finish. His face went pale, and he stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. "Nick," he whispered, "get inside, now." "What? Why?" "Just do it." I didn't argue. I scrambled into the small cabin, my heart pounding. Through the window, I saw Tom grab a knife and stand at the edge of the deck, his body tense. "Tom, what's going on?" I shouted. He didn't reply. He was staring at the water like he expected it to attack him. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, enormous and slow-moving, circling beneath the boat. It surfaced briefly, a sleek, black form that glistened in the sunlight. At first, I thought it was a whale, but then I saw its mouth. Rows of jagged teeth lined a gaping maw, far too wide for any shark. "Holy shit," I breathed. The thing dove again, and the boat rocked violently as it passed beneath us. "It's testing us," Tom said, his voice tight. "It's trying to tip us over." "What do we do?" I asked. Tom didn't answer. He grabbed the flare gun from the cabin and fired it into the water. The flare hissed as it hit the surface, sending up a plume of steam. For a moment, the shadow vanished. "Did it work?" I asked, barely daring to hope. Tom shook his head. "I don't think so." The creature returned with terrifying speed, slamming into the hull with enough force to knock me off my feet. The sound of splintering wood filled the air, and water began to pour in through the cracks. "We're sinking!" I shouted. "Get the life raft!" Tom yelled. I scrambled to the emergency compartment, pulling out the inflatable raft. The boat shuddered again, tilting sharply to one side. "Hurry!" Tom shouted. I threw the raft overboard and grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him toward the edge. But before we could jump, the creature reared out of the water. It was massive, its slick black body glistening with seawater. Its head was serpentine, with small black eyes that seemed to burn with malevolence. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of teeth that spiraled inward like the maw of some prehistoric nightmare. Tom froze, his eyes wide with terror. "Move!" I screamed, shoving him toward the raft. We dove into the water just as the boat capsized. I surfaced, gasping, and saw the creature coiling around the wreckage like a python squeezing the life out of its prey. "Swim!" Tom shouted, and we paddled frantically toward the raft. We climbed in, our hands trembling as we clung to the sides. The creature circled us, its black eyes fixed on our tiny inflatable refuge. "Do you think it'll leave us alone?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom didn't answer. He was staring at the creature, his face pale. "It's not just a fish," he said finally. "It's something else, something old." The creature dove beneath the surface, and for a moment I thought it was gone. Then the raft lurched violently, nearly flipping over. "Hold on," Tom shouted, grabbing the emergency oars. He paddled frantically, but the creature was relentless, ramming us again and again. It screamed, a deep, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. "I don't think we're getting out of this," Tom said, his voice flat. "Don't say that," I shouted. "There has to be a way." But before I could finish, the creature reared out of the water, its massive jaws snapping shut inches from the raft. The force of the impact sent us flying into the water. I surfaced, coughing and choking, just in time to see the creature lunge at Tom. He screamed as it wrapped around him, dragging him under. "Tom!" I shouted, but it was too late. The water turned red and he was gone. I swam toward the raft, my arms burning with exhaustion. The creature circled me, its black eyes glinting with cruel intelligence. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it dove beneath the waves and disappeared. I don't know how long I floated there, clinging to the raft, waiting for it to come back. Eventually, a rescue boat found me. I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said Tom was lost in a rogue wave, that the damage to the boat was from debris. But I know the truth. The ocean keeps its secrets, and what I saw out there was no ordinary predator. It was something ancient, something hungry, and I'll never go back.
Story number 5.
I had always loved the ocean, but what happened that night changed everything. My friends and I had planned the trip for weeks, an overnight deep-sea fishing expedition to celebrate my best friend Jake's birthday. There were 4 of us: Jake, his girlfriend Emma, my brother Sam, and me. We rented a boat, stocked it with fishing gear, snacks, and enough beer to keep us laughing through the night. The captain, a grizzled man named Harry, was no nonsense but friendly enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we set out, the coastline fading into darkness behind us. Harry knew his stuff. He navigated to a spot he called the Devil's Eye, where he swore the biggest fish lurked. The name unsettled me, but Jake was thrilled. "We're catching something huge tonight," he declared, raising a beer and a toast. The first few hours were uneventful, just the hum of the engine and the occasional splash of bait hitting the water. Emma and I chatted while Jake and Sam took turns with the rods. The sea was calm, the sky clear, and the stars brighter than I'd ever seen. Around midnight, Jake got a bite. At first, it seemed like a normal catch. He struggled with the rod, grinning as the reel screamed. "This one's a fighter," he shouted. Sam grabbed a flashlight, shining it over the water as Jake hauled the line closer. Then the rod bent at an impossible angle. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his grin fading. He braced himself against the side of the boat, pulling with all his strength. Whatever was on the other end wasn't just heavy. It was alive, thrashing with a force that shook the entire boat. "Cut the line," Harry said, his voice suddenly tense. "What? No way," Jake protested. "Cut it," Harry barked. "You don't want whatever that is." Jake ignored him, gritting his teeth as he continued to reel. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances. Harry was usually calm, even jovial, but now he looked scared. Then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow under the water, massive and serpentine. It moved with unnatural speed, circling the boat. The flashlight's beam caught a flash of pale, rubbery skin, covered in jagged scars and growths that pulsed like they were alive. "What the hell is that?" Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the creature breached the surface. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. Its head was elongated, with rows of needle-like teeth that gleamed in the light. Its eyes were too large, black and lifeless, like twin voids. Tentacle-like appendages trailed behind it, each tipped with barbed hooks that glistened with something slimy and dark. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, like the groan of a ship breaking apart. Then it lunged. Jake screamed as the rod was yanked from his hands, the line snapping like a gunshot. The creature dove beneath the boat, slamming into the hull with enough force to send us all sprawling. "Get inside," Harry shouted, grabbing a flare gun. We scrambled into the tiny cabin as the boat rocked violently. Through the window, I saw Harry fire the flare, the red light streaking across the water. For a moment, it seemed to work. The creature retreated, vanishing into the dark waves. But the relief was short-lived. The boat lurched again, harder this time, and water began pouring in through a crack in the hull. "We're sinking!" Emma screamed. "Life vests! Now!" Harry yelled, tossing them to us. We fumbled with the straps as the creature reappeared, its massive body coiling around the boat like a constrictor. It squeezed, the hull groaning under the pressure. Harry fired another flare, but the thing barely flinched. "I've seen this before," he muttered, his voice grim. "What?" I asked, my chest tightening. "It doesn't stop. It doesn't let go." The boat tilted sharply, water rushing in faster. Harry grabbed a harpoon gun from a storage compartment, his hands shaking as he loaded it. "We're not making it out of this," he said quietly. Then he opened the cabin door and stepped out. "Harry, no!" I shouted, but he didn't look back. The creature reared up, its hooked tentacles flailing as Harry fired the harpoon. The shot struck it square in the head, and for a moment, it let out a shriek so loud it felt like my eardrums would burst. But instead of retreating, it attacked with renewed fury. Harry didn't stand a chance. One of the tentacles lashed out, wrapping around him and dragging him into the water. His screams were cut short as he disappeared beneath the surface. "Go!" Sam shouted, grabbing the emergency life raft. He tossed it overboard, and we jumped, the cold water shocking my system. We climbed into the raft, our breath coming in ragged gasps as we paddled away from the sinking boat. The creature circled us, its black eyes glinting in the starlight. "Is it going to attack?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jake said, his hands gripping the oars so tightly his knuckles turned white. The creature seemed to toy with us, bumping the raft and letting out low, guttural growls. It felt like hours passed as we drifted, our nerves fraying with every passing second. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. We paddled until dawn, when a passing fishing boat spotted us and pulled us aboard. When we told the crew what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "You were at the Devil's Eye?" one of them asked. "Yeah," Jake said. "Why?" The man shook his head. "That place has a reputation. That boats go missing out there all the time. Whatever you saw, you're lucky to be alive." Lucky wasn't the word I'd use. Even now, weeks later, I can't close my eyes without seeing that creature. Its lifeless black eyes haunt my dreams, and I wake up gasping, convinced I can still hear the groaning sound it made. I haven't been near the ocean since, and I don't think I ever will. Some things are meant to stay in the deep.
Story number 6.
The plan was simple, a night of deep-sea fishing off the Oregon coast. My coworker Mark had talked me into it. promising the kind of adventure I hadn't had in years. The water's alive this time of year, he said, his eyes glinting with excitement. Big fish, clear skies, and total quiet. Just us and the ocean. We set out just before sunset, with Mark's friend Carl piloting the small fishing boat. It wasn't much, old, weathered wood, and a creaking engine, but Carl swore it was seaworthy. As the horizon swallowed the sun, we were miles from shore, surrounded by the inky blackness of the Pacific. The air was cold, carrying the faint metallic tang of salt water. The boat rocked gently as we baited our lines and cast them into the depths. Mark and Carl swapped stories, laughing over beers, but I couldn't shake a growing unease. There was something about the way the waves moved, a strange rhythm that didn't feel natural. And the quiet, it wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like the ocean was holding its breath. Around 10 p.m., Mark got a bite. "Here we go," he shouted, gripping the rod as it bent under the weight of whatever was below. He struggled with it, laughing at first, but then his expression changed. "This is heavy," he said, his voice strained. Carl grabbed a flashlight and shone it over the water, the beam slicing through the darkness. Something massive was pulling against the line, dragging the boat slightly as Mark reeled it closer. Then the line went slack. "Damn it," Mark cursed, reeling in the empty hook. But Carl was still shining the flashlight, his face pale. "What is it?" I asked. "Look," he whispered, pointing toward the water. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, about 20 feet from the boat, a shape emerged. It was faint, almost translucent, a shimmering, humanoid figure that seemed to hover just beneath the surface. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, stepping back. The figure drifted closer, and I realized with a sickening lurch that it wasn't alone. More of them appeared, pale and ghostly, their forms flickering like reflections on glass. They surrounded the boat, their empty eyes fixed on us. Carl dropped the flashlight, his hands shaking. "We need to leave. Now." Mark didn't argue. He scrambled to the cockpit and fired up the engine. But as the boat started to move, the figures reacted. They surged upward, breaking the surface with an unearthly wail. Their faces were gaunt, stretched too thin, and their mouths hung open as if in silent screams. One of them reached for the boat, its long, skeletal fingers grazing the side. "Go faster!" I shouted, but the engine sputtered and died. Carl swore, yanking at the starter cord, but it wouldn't catch. The boat was dead in the water, and the figures were closing in. One of them climbed onto the deck, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold that seeped into my bones. I grabbed a fishing rod and swung it wildly, the metal pole passing right through the figure as if it weren't there. But it turned its head, and I swear it smiled. Mark grabbed a flare gun and fired it into the air. The bright light illuminated the ocean, and for a moment the figures recoiled, their translucent forms shimmering like heat waves. "Keep them away!" Carl shouted, frantically trying to restart the engine. Mark fired another flare, and the figures backed off slightly, but they didn't leave. They circled the boat, their haunting wails growing louder, and then the water around us began to churn. At first, it was subtle, a gentle ripple that quickly grew into a violent whirlpool. The boat tilted dangerously, the deck slick with seawater. "We're sinking!" Mark shouted, grabbing the life vests. Carl abandoned the engine, his face pale with terror. "We'll never make it in the raft, not with them out there. Do you have a better idea?" I snapped, my voice high with panic. We tossed the inflatable raft overboard and climbed in, the cold water soaking through our clothes. The figures stayed at the edge of the whirlpool, their empty eyes watching us as we paddled away. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then I saw the shadow. It rose from the depths, massive and writhing, its form too vast to comprehend. Tentacles, slick and glistening, reached toward us, and at their center was a mouth, a gaping maw lined with rows of jagged teeth. "Oh my God," Carl whispered. The creature let out a sound, low and rumbling, that I felt more than heard. The raft rocked violently as one of the tentacles brushed against it, leaving a trail of slime. "Paddle!" Mark shouted, but it was useless. The whirlpool pulled us closer to the creature, its massive body blocking out the moonlight. The ghostly figures reappeared, hovering around the creature like attendants. They didn't attack, they simply watched, their hollow eyes filled with something that might have been pity. The tentacle wrapped around the raft, squeezing with a force that made the air rush from my lungs. The fabric tore, and we were thrown into the freezing water. I surfaced, gasping, and saw Mark struggling against the current. Carl was nowhere to be seen. "Swim!" I shouted, though I didn't know where we could go. Mark didn't make it. A tentacle coiled around his waist, dragging him under before he could even scream. I paddled frantically, my limbs burning with exhaustion. The ghostly figures followed me, their faces calm and expressionless. When I finally saw the searchlight of a rescue boat, I almost cried with relief. They pulled me aboard, wrapping me in a blanket as I shivered uncontrollably. "You're lucky," one of them said. "We don't usually find anyone alive this far out." I tried to tell them what happened, but they didn't believe me. They said it was hypothermia, that I was hallucinating, but I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there, waiting in the deep.
Story number 7.
It started as a birthday celebration, a late-night fishing trip out on the Gulf of Mexico for my brother Chris's 30th. There were 4 of us: Chris, his girlfriend Megan, my buddy Tyler, and me. We rented a decent-sized boat, loaded it with fishing gear, snacks, and beer, and set out just as the sun was sinking below the horizon. The water was calm, almost eerily so, and the sky was painted with streaks of deep orange and purple. Chris had always loved the ocean, so this was his dream birthday. We cracked jokes, reeled in a few small catches, and marveled at the stars that blanketed the sky. By midnight, we drifted far from the shoreline. It was just us and the vast expanse of water. The air was still, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the occasional creak of the boat. Then the fish stopped biting. "It's like the ocean just shut off," Chris said, staring at the still surface. "Maybe we drifted too far," Megan suggested, though her voice wavered. Tyler checked the GPS. "We're fine. This spot's supposed to be prime for big catches. Let's give it a bit longer." Something splashed in the distance, loud enough to make us all jump. "Probably a dolphin," I said, trying to sound calm. But as the minutes passed, more splashes followed, closer and more erratic. Megan shone a flashlight over the water. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the rippling surface. But there was nothing there. No fish, no dolphins. "Let's pack it up," Chris said finally, his voice tight. We started reeling in the lines when something hit the boat, a dull, heavy thud that made the whole vessel shudder. "What the hell was that?" Tyler asked, looking over the side. I followed his gaze, my stomach tightening. A dark shape was floating near the boat, bobbing just beneath the surface. At first I thought it was driftwood, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately. "Shark?" Chris guessed, but he didn't sound convinced. The shape sank out of sight, leaving behind a faint ripple. We stood frozen, staring at the water, until Megan screamed. Something shot up from the depths, a pale, skeletal hand that grabbed the edge of the boat. Its fingers were impossibly long, like the skin stretched thin over jagged bones. Chris grabbed a fishing gaff and swung it at the hand. It let go with a wet, sucking sound, disappearing back into the water. "What was that?" Megan shrieked, clutching my arm. "I don't know," Chris said, his voice shaking. "We're leaving. Now." Tyler fired up the engine, and the boat lurched forward, cutting through the water at full speed. But the feeling of safety was short-lived. A guttural, echoing sound rose from the depths like the moan of a dying whale. It vibrated through the hull, making my teeth ache. And then the boat stopped. "What's wrong?" I asked Tyler, but he was already fiddling with the controls. "The engine's dead," he said. "I don't understand. It was fine a second ago." The moaning sound grew louder, and the water around us began to churn. Something massive was rising from the depths. We scrambled to the other side of the boat as the surface broke, revealing a towering figure. It was humanoid, but grotesquely distorted. Its limbs too long, its torso impossibly thin. Seaweed and barnacles clung to its waterlogged skin, and its head was featureless, save for a gaping, toothless maw. The creature leaned over the boat, dripping seawater and emitting a foul, briny stench. Its eyeless gaze seemed to bore into each of us, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was being pulled into a void. "Don't move," Chris whispered, though his voice trembled. The creature reached out, its bony fingers grazing the railing. Megan whimpered, and the sound seemed to trigger something in the thing. It let out a deafening wail, a sound so piercing it felt like my skull was splitting. Chris grabbed a flare gun and fired it directly at the creature's chest. The flare exploded in a burst of red light, and the thing recoiled, letting out a guttural hiss. "Go! Paddle if you have to!" Chris shouted, grabbing an oar. We worked frantically, using whatever we could find to push the boat forward. The creature stayed back, but its wailing continued, joined by other sounds, splashes and groans coming from all around us. "They're everywhere," Tyler said, his face pale. Shapes were emerging from the water, dozens of them, smaller than the first creature, but just as horrifying. Gaunt, waterlogged figures with hollow eyes and skeletal faces. They moved with unnatural speed, their bony hands clawing at the boat. "We're not going to make it," Megan sobbed. "Yes, we are," Chris said, though his voice cracked. "Keep moving." The boat lurched as one of the creatures climbed aboard. It let out a guttural growl, lunging for Tyler. He swung an oar at it, but the thing didn't even flinch. It grabbed him by the arm, dragging him toward the edge of the boat. "Help me!" Tyler screamed, but before any of us could react, he was gone, pulled into the water. "No!" Chris shouted, leaning over the side, but there was no sign of Tyler, only the dark, churning waves. The creatures swarmed, their wails deafening. Chris fired the last flare, the light illuminating their ghastly faces for a split second before it was swallowed by the darkness. "Jump!" he shouted. "What?" I yelled back, thinking he'd lost his mind. "Jump! It's our only chance!" Megan and I hesitated, but the boat was sinking fast, the water flooding the deck. Chris didn't wait. He dove into the water, and Megan and I followed, the icy cold stealing the breath from my lungs. We swam blindly, the salty water stinging my eyes. The wailing grew fainter, and when I finally dared to look back, the boat was gone, swallowed by the ocean along with the creatures. A fishing trawler found us at dawn, drifting miles from where we'd started. They pulled us aboard, wrapping us in blankets as we shivered uncontrollably. "Where's your friend?" one of the fishermen asked. I couldn't answer. The Coast Guard searched the area but found nothing. No boat, no bodies, no sign that anything had been there at all. Megan refuses to talk about that night, and Chris hasn't set foot on a boat since. As for me, I still dream about those creatures, about their hollow eyes and their wails that seem to echo from the depths of hell. And sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I swear I can hear the sound of water dripping.
Story number 8.
It was my dad's idea. He'd been a fisherman for over 30 years, and deep-sea fishing was his escape from everything: work, stress, even family. "You'll love it," he'd said, practically dragging me out of bed at 4 a.m. "It's quiet, peaceful, just the ocean and us." I'd agreed reluctantly. Peaceful wasn't my thing, but it was his birthday, and I hadn't spent much time with him lately. So there we were, 100 miles off the Florida coast in his creaky old fishing boat, surrounded by endless water. The first few hours weren't bad. The sun rose in a blaze of orange and gold, and the sea sparkled like a million diamonds. We caught a few decent fish, joked around, and drank coffee from his old thermos. Then, just before noon, we hooked something big. Dad's face lit up as he grabbed the rod. "This is it, son. Big fish. Maybe a tuna, or even a marlin." The line jerked violently, almost pulling him overboard. I grabbed the rod to help, and together we fought whatever was on the other end. It was strong, stronger than any fish I'd ever seen. The line strained, the reel screamed, and the boat swayed under the weight. After what felt like an eternity, the fight stopped. The line went slack, and Dad reeled it in, cursing under his breath. But when the hook emerged, it wasn't empty. A ragged, torn piece of netting hung from it, crusted with barnacles and seaweed. It looked ancient, like it had been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for decades. "What the hell?" Dad muttered, pulling it off the hook. He stared at it for a long moment, then tossed it aside. "Just junk," he said, but his voice sounded off, uneasy. The air felt heavier after that. The sun dimmed behind a thin veil of clouds, and the water, once vibrant and sparkling, turned a dull slate gray. "Let's move to another spot," Dad said, firing up the engine. But no matter where we went, the feeling followed us, like we were being watched. The fish stopped biting, and the ocean grew eerily still. It wasn't until late afternoon that things got worse. We were drifting in silence when I saw something in the distance, a shape, faint and hazy, rising from the water. At first I thought it was a buoy, but it was too tall, too narrow. "Dad," I said, pointing. He squinted at it, his brow furrowed. "What is that?" The shape was closer now, and I could make it out more clearly. It was a mast, a broken, splintered mast of an old ship, jutting out of the water like a skeletal finger. "That's impossible," Dad muttered, grabbing the binoculars. The rest of the ship emerged as we drifted closer, a massive, decaying hulk, its wood blackened with age and salt. The name on the side was barely legible, the letters faded and corroded. Persephone. "It's a ghost ship," I said, half joking, trying to lighten the mood. Dad didn't laugh. He just stared at the ship, his face pale. "That's not funny." The air around us grew colder, and the smell hit us, a putrid stench of rotting fish and decaying wood. The water around the ship was unnaturally dark, like a stain spreading across the ocean. "We need to leave." Dad said, his voice trembling. But the engine wouldn't start. He tried again and again, cursing and banging on the controls, but the boat refused to move. Try the radio, I suggested, my own voice shaking. But the radio was dead too. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps on the ship's deck. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. There's someone on board, I whispered, though I didn't believe it. Don't be ridiculous, Dad snapped, but his hands were shaking. The footsteps grew louder, and then a figure appeared at the edge of the ship. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was bloated and gray, his clothes tattered and soaked. Seaweed clung to his body, and his eyes were hollow sockets, black and empty. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The man, or whatever he was, stared at us for what felt like an eternity. Then he raised an arm, pointing directly at our boat. The water around us began to churn. "Get the flare gun!" Dad shouted, snapping me out of my stupor. I scrambled for the emergency kit, pulling out the flare gun and firing it into the air. The red light illuminated the scene, casting long, flickering shadows across the ship. More figures emerged. Dozens of them, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They lined the deck, staring silently, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. "We're leaving," Dad said, grabbing an oar. "Help me paddle." We worked frantically, pushing the boat away from the ship. But the water was fighting us, pulling us back toward it. And then something grabbed the boat. The whole vessel lurched, nearly tipping over. I looked over the side and saw a hand, a bloated, gray hand with jagged nails, gripping the edge. Another hand appeared, then another, until dozens of them were clawing at the boat. They climbed aboard, their movements jerky and unnatural. The air was filled with the stench of decay and the sound of water dripping from their bodies. "Stay back," Dad shouted, swinging an oar at the nearest figure. It connected with a sickening crunch, but the thing didn't even flinch. I fired another flare, the light searing into my eyes. The figures recoiled, hissing like snakes, but they didn't leave. The boat was sinking. "Jump!" Dad yelled, shoving me toward the edge. "No!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. "Do it!" he barked, his eyes wild with fear. I hesitated, but the boat was going under fast. I had no choice. The water was freezing, stealing the breath from my lungs. I kicked frantically, trying to stay afloat, but the current was strong, dragging me toward the ship. "Dad!" I screamed, but he didn't answer. I turned just in time to see him go under, pulled down by the figures that swarmed the boat. I swam blindly, the salt stinging my eyes and throat. The ship grew smaller behind me, but I could still hear the sound of the figures, moaning, hissing, calling out in voices that weren't human. A passing cargo ship found me hours later clinging to a piece of driftwood. They said I was lucky to be alive, but I don't feel lucky. Every night, I dream of that ship, of its hollow-eyed crew and the way they stared at me like they were marking me. Sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can hear their voices calling my name, and I know they're still out there waiting for me.
Story number 9.
I'll never forget the night my friends and I ventured out for a fishing trip on Lake Superior. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a casual outing under a moonlit sky. But what happened that night haunts me to this day. There were 5 of us. Me, my best friend Mark, his girlfriend Hannah, and 2 brothers from our college group, Alex and Jake. We'd rented a sturdy little fishing boat, packed snacks and beers, and set out around dusk. The lake was calm, almost unnervingly so. Superior is known for its unpredictable temperament, but that evening it was like glass, reflecting the darkening sky perfectly. We laughed, joked, and cast our lines into the deep water, completely unaware of what was lurking beneath us. The first sign of trouble came about an hour in. We were anchored in a quiet cove, surrounded by towering cliffs. The moonlight barely reached the water, giving everything a ghostly glow. I was reeling in a line when I noticed something odd. A strange shape floating a few yards from the boat. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked, pointing. The others turned, squinting into the darkness. "It's probably just driftwood," Mark said, but his tone was uncertain. Driftwood doesn't usually move against the current. Hannah shone a flashlight over the water, and the beam illuminated it, a pale, human-like shape bobbing just below the surface. "What the hell?" Alex muttered by leaning closer. At first, we thought it was a body, but as the light hit it, I realized it wasn't human. The features were wrong: elongated limbs, an impossibly narrow torso, and a face devoid of eyes or a mouth. Its skin was translucent, almost glowing, and it shimmered like a fish's scales. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, it moved, swiftly, unnaturally, darting beneath the boat. We froze, staring into the water, but the creature was gone. Maybe it's some kind of fish? Hannah offered, though she sounded far from convinced. A fish with arms and legs? Alex shot back. Mark shook his head. Let's not overthink it. Probably some weird animal. This lake's full of strange stuff. He tried to brush it off, but the mood had shifted. The laughter and easy conversation were gone, replaced by uneasy glances at the water. We decided to move to another spot, but as Jake pulled up the anchor, he stopped abruptly. Guys, something's down there, he said, his voice trembling. I leaned over the side and looked. Tangled in the anchor line was a mass of slimy black tendrils like seaweed but thicker and pulsating faintly, as if alive. Cut it off, Mark said quickly. Jake grabbed a knife and sawed through the line, the tendrils falling away into the water. But as they sank, I thought I saw them move, coiling and uncoiling like they were reaching for something. We motored to a new spot, farther from the cliffs, but the unease followed us. The lake was too quiet, no fish jumping, no sound of waves lapping against the boat. Just silence, broken only by our nervous chatter. And then the lights went out. The boat's engines sputtered and died, plunging us into darkness. Even the flashlight Hannah was holding flickered and went out. What the hell is going on? Alex shouted, his voice echoing across the still water. Mark fumbled with the engine, but it wouldn't start. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened, pressing in on us like a physical weight. Then we heard it, a low, guttural sound rising from the depths. It wasn't a splash or a wave, it was a voice. No, not one voice. Many. They were whispering, overlapping in a language I didn't recognize. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, surrounding us, coming from every direction. Get the oars, Mark said, his voice shaking. We're getting out of here. But before we could move, something hit the boat. A heavy, jarring impact that nearly knocked us off our feet. What was that? Hannah screamed. We grabbed the sides of the boat, staring into the water, but there was nothing there. Then it hit again, harder this time, tilting the boat dangerously to one side. Paddle! Now! Mark shouted. We grabbed the oars and rowed frantically, but the whispers grew louder, turning into guttural moans that vibrated through the hull. And then they rose. The creatures. They emerged from the water one by one, surrounding the boat. Their translucent bodies shimmered in the moonlight, their eyeless faces fixed on us. They moved in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. One of them reached for the boat, its elongated fingers curling over the edge. Mark swung an oar at it, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it grabbed the oar, snapping it in half with a sickening crack. "We're not gonna make it!" Alex shouted, his voice breaking. "Yes, we are!" Mark yelled back. "Keep paddling!" But it was hopeless. The creatures were everywhere, their guttural moans drowning out our panicked screams. One of them grabbed Hannah, its bony hand wrapping around her arm. She screamed, trying to pull away, but it was too strong. "Help me," she shrieked, but before we could react, it dragged her overboard. "No!" Mark shouted, diving after her. The rest of us froze, too terrified to move. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds, I couldn't tell. The whispers faded, and the water grew still again. Then Mark resurfaced, gasping for air, but he was alone. "She's gone," he said, his voice hollow. We pulled him back into the boat, but none of us spoke. The creatures were gone, the lake eerily calm once more. Somehow the engines started again, sputtering to life as if nothing had happened. We motored back to shore in silence, our minds numb with shock. The authorities didn't believe us when we told them what happened. They said Hannah must have fallen overboard and drowned, her body carried away by the currents. But we know the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I hear those whispers again, faint and distant, calling to me. And I know they're still out there, waiting in the depths, waiting for someone else to venture too far.